The time now approached for Lady Russell's return. The day was even fixed, and Anne, being engaged to join her as soon as she was resettled, was looking forward to an early removal to Kellynch. I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're reading chapters 11 and 12 of Persuasion. So what's your 100-word summary of the chapters?
Captain Wentworth hears from his naval friend Harville at Lyme, and all the young people plan an overnight visit. They meet another naval officer, Benwick, whose fiancé has recently died, and Anne compares her situation to his, discusses poetry with him, and recommends he read more serious literature. The next morning, Anne and Henrietta walk on the Cobb. Anne listens to Henrietta's hopes of an early marriage. They are joined by Wentworth and Louisa. Louisa, practicing firmness, insists on being jumped down the steps, falls and hurts her head. Henrietta faints. Anne, in combination with Wentworth, handles the situation.
Okay. Well, this is mine. There are some overlaps in terminology. The young people visit Lyme, meeting Captains Harville and Benwick. Benwick and Anne talk about poetry, which he's been indulging in since the death of his fiancée, Harville's sister. The group encounters a gentleman who clearly admires Anne, and later learn he's Mr. Elliot, heir to Kellynch. Louisa demands that Wentworth jump her down the steps of the Cobb, but she falls and is knocked unconscious. The Harvilles insist on looking after her, and Charles will not leave. Anne was going to stay too, but Mary had a tantrum, so she stays and Anne goes with the others back to Uppercross. Yeah, I thought it'd be easy to do a 100-word summary of this because it's only 2 chapters, but even so, I had to cut out a lot of the nuance. So I'm glad you got in the bit about Anne recommending more prose to Benwick, because I had to cut that out of my original draft.
Yes.
So chapter 11 starts with a passage that ends up being really quite irrelevant to what most of these 2 chapters is about, which is Anne thinking about Lady Russell's return and going to stay with her and how that will impact her relationship with Wentworth. And the irony that she's going to be moving closer to him, but he spends so much time at Uppercross that actually she's going to be seeing less of him.
Well, I suppose what that's telling us is that Anne is still brooding about Wentworth, reliving the past. So, in spite of all the talk that she's going to give to Benwick, she's doing a great deal of indulging in the sort of thing that she's going to later blame him for.
I'm not sure she's being self-indulgent. I think it's more about she's trying to manage herself so that she doesn't.
Well, I suppose we could say that what we're seeing there is Jane Austen showing how someone performs the sort of activities that Anne is going to recommend to Benwick. Yeah. That you don't read poetry, you don't quote stuff, but you do think seriously about what's going to happen. I must control myself. Yes, you're right there. But on the other hand, no, she is terribly aware that this is something she's got to think about.
And Wentworth's presence is still disrupting her life.
And all the efforts she's made up till now to be calm and not read poetry and so on are still there.
However, the bulk of these 2 chapters is the visit to Lyme.
Yes.
And according to the notes in my Cambridge edition, the Austen family went to Lyme for holidays in 1803 and in 1804. Lyme is 17 miles away, and none of them have ever been there before.
Yes.
And when they get to Lyme, it's like something out of a travel magazine. Suddenly we get all this description of, it talks about the amusement and variety of Lyme as a public place. There's nothing to admire in the buildings themselves, but it talks about the walk to the Cobb, skirting the pleasant little bay, which in the season is animated with bathing machines and company. The Cobb itself, its old wonders and new improvements, with the very beautiful line of cliffs stretching out to the end of the town. Then it goes on to talk about Charmouth and Up Lyme.
I just have to say, that I went there with that description in my head, and what I was totally blown away with was by the view of that cliff. at the end of the bay, which sort of seemed to me so dramatic, and particularly in the countryside we'd been going through just before we got there. Did that strike you at all?
I don't remember. Like so many people, the main thing I wanted to see in Lyme was the Cobb.
Yes, well, see, this was the thing that I went there thinking, and what I was actually struck by was those cliffs. I presume those are the cliffs where all the dinosaur bones were being discovered at about the time Jane Austen was visiting it. But, I wasn't thinking of that, I didn't know that, but I was truly impressed by the sort of lowering cliffs.
Because, if you go to Lyme now, there's a lot of emphasis on the fossils.
Well, there wasn't then.
Yeah. But before we get to that, we meet the Harvilles and Benwick, and one thing that struck me that I'd not really noticed before until this read is the description of Harville, and it says he's not a reader, and of course he can't do much because of his injury, but he does all this handiwork type stuff. Yeah. There's all these things he's made, and that is so like Mrs. Smith later in the book. She can't do anything. And so she's been busy with her hands making stuff.
I don't really feel that comparison. I mean, I just feel it's sort of such a different sort of gender occupation they're involved in. And, I see Captain Harville as, that kind of man that can't have anything the matter with his house.
Yeah.
If something gets a tiny bit out of place, he rushes off and fixes it up.
Yeah.
He keeps thinking it would be a good idea if we had some shelves here. He's seen some fancy toy on television and he thinks I might make. That's the picture I have as of him being that sort of person.
I kind of see this comparison that they used to be more active, they're now for different reasons constrained, and yet they're both keeping themselves busy and staying positive.
I suppose you could make that parallel.
Yeah.
No, I tend to think of them as sort of different.
Yeah. Then Anne and Benwick, hearing Benwick's sad story, and Anne compares it to herself, but then also thinks, he has not perhaps a more sorrowing heart than I have. I cannot believe his prospects to be blighted forever. He is younger than I am, younger in feeling, if not in fact. It's kind of like she's thinking, it's too late for me, but he's still young and he'll recover and find someone else, which is contrary. Like, she had a chance to marry someone else and she chose not to because she never met anyone as good as Wentworth. But she's assuming that Benwick will have no problem finding someone else as good as Fanny Harville.
Well, perhaps she thinks that Fanny Harville couldn't have been of the same quality as Captain Wentworth.
I love this bit where you have Anne and Benwick talking about poetry. And the description where it says that he was shy and disposed to abstraction, but as soon as she starts talking to him about poetry, they suddenly get on this whole...
Well, they found a subject they have in common, yes.
But the description of having talked of poetry, the richness of the present age, and gone through a brief comparison of opinion as to the first-rate poets, trying to ascertain whether Marmion or the Lady of the Lake were to be preferred. And I just thought, Anne has been reading this stuff, and probably since Captain Wentworth left, assuming Captain Wentworth was a reader, and I think we have to assume that even though it's not explicitly stated, but she's had no one to talk to about this because Lady Russell doesn't seem to be into poetry. So just imagine what this must be feeling like to Anne, to find someone she can have an argument about Marmion or the Lady of the Lake. Yeah. She can talk about how the G is to be pronounced. Yeah. I love those little snippets she gives of the kinds of things people who connect over books talk about.
Yes.
I thought it was lovely.
Yes.
And it made me feel, as I said, so sorry for Anne that in those days before the internet, where she had a small circle of acquaintance, she didn't have anyone she could talk about books with.
Yes, particularly if Lady Russell was well into all these moralist letter writers. And
yes.
Yes, so what you're suggesting is that, in a sense, what we've got is another of these real similarities between Anne and Benwick, that, in fact, they're both coming together. They've got a similar experience of a lost love. They've got this similar experience of reading poetry, a similar experience of not, in fact, meeting anyone else they can talk to about poetry.
It's not surprising that they really click and that Benwick keeps coming back to her and She enjoys talking with him because...
I don't know. When I was reading that through, I got this bit of this sort of feeling of Anne, she's a bit prim and proper. She's taking a position of the superior, the better one.
She is, but at the same time, she can't be being too strict about it or Benwick wouldn't come back to her the next day.
Oh, no, I'm not thinking that she would have put him off. I mean, she would have done it so sweetly.
Yeah.
And again, she was probably a bit aware it was sort of the pot calling the kettle black.
She thinks that later when it says Anne could not but be amused at the idea of her coming to Lyme to preach patience and resignation to a young man whom she had never seen before, nor could she help fearing, on more serious reflection, that, like many other great moralists and preachers, she had been eloquent on a point in which her own conduct would ill bear examination.
Just another thing, the moralists. I thought, I'll see if I can find out who these people are that she was going to read to him. And I sort of couldn't find anyone who's gone to any trouble to say who were these biographies of these people that showed.
The notes in the Cambridge edition say, such a list would very possibly include Samuel Johnson's periodical The Rambler, which James Boswell praised as containing more bark and steel for the mind than any other writings. In number 32 on the art of bearing calamities, Johnson urged his readers that the calamities of life, like the necessities of nature, are calls to labour and exercises of diligence. Number 47 on sorrow recommended employment as the safe and general antidote.
Well, I've been looking in things like moralists themselves. Well, I was looking through the little book I've got, which has got Dr. Gregory and Mrs. Chapone. These are ones that are addressed to women.
Yeah.
And I thought, for sure they'll have a set of reading on this.
Yeah.
And they don't.
And that's really the bulk of what happens in Chapter 11. So Chapter 12 starts before breakfast the next day. Anne and Henrietta go for a walk on the Cobb. And Henrietta is being so transparent in her discussion about, I'm concerned for the health of Dr. Shirley and wouldn't it be great if he retired here and we should encourage him.
Well, I mean, but it comes through as just very sweet.
It does.
I think perhaps I should just finally fill in a tiny bit about the curate there to go on with what I talked about in the last episode.
Yeah.
And that's that we've just got this perfect example of the kind of way parishes could be passed on. And we've got completely straightforward. What Henrietta would love is for Dr. Shirley, who's probably saved up quite a lot of money, to retire to Lyme and live on his savings. Well, he hires Charles Hayter so he and Henrietta can get married. Though, actually, if he's Dr. Shirley at Upper Cross, it's quite possible that that is a college living, which means that if he does what Henrietta wants and moves himself off to Lyme, everything will be fine for them. But if it's a college living, once he dies, that'll be the end of that living for them. They may be able to stay on as curates, but it's fairly unlikely because almost certainly there'll be some other fellow of the college, who wants to get married and get a good... But on the other hand, he may, they may pick up a family living.
Yeah. So that's sort of a kind of amusing diversion from the main thrust of the time in Lyme, because the next thing that happens is they meet up with Captain Wentworth and with Louisa, who've also gone for a walk on the Cobb before breakfast. Yeah. And then as they're going back up to the inn, that's when they have the encounter with the unknown gentleman.
So she sort of slipped in now something for us to be looking forward to.
Yeah.
We haven't got to just worry about Captain Wentworth and Louisa and what's happening between them. We've got this rejuvenation of Anne plot. Her appearance is improving. Her prospects are improving. So we're starting to get what may turn into a will she, won't she?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we ever have any real doubts that
on rereading it, the connection with Benwick, the idea that she's finally got someone she can talk to about books, And then the next day, this strange gentleman who obviously appreciates how she looks. So for the first time, we're suddenly told she's looking pretty as well.
Yes.
So maybe you do start to think possibly the book is going to take a sharp left turn and she'll end up with Benwick.
Well, is it going to turn to Benwick or is it going to turn to Mr. Elliot? We've got two potential suitors.
Well, we don't really know if this mysterious gentleman, at this stage, he could just be a passerby.
Yes.
But the other thing I wonder, Captain Wentworth notices the gentleman noticing Anne. How are we meant to take that? Because some of the adaptations actually show him being jealous of someone else admiring Anne.
Oh,
Do we think it's a step towards him acknowledging his own feelings for Anne, or is it just what it says on the page, that he sees this other man noticing and thinks, yes, you are looking better at the moment?
My feeling is I never expected that he was moving that close towards Anne. This is the first in a series of occasions when...
all in this chapter, when he recognises Anne's value.
Yes, when he's starting to see more about her.
So when this gentleman appears on the steps, we don't necessarily think anything of it except it's an excuse to say Anne's looking pretty again. But then she bumps into him again in the inn and start to think, well, maybe there's something more to this. And then we get the bit where we find out who he is, just as he's left.
Yes.
Which again, we get Mary being very funny, saying, do you think he had the Elliot countenance? I hardly looked at him. I was looking at the horses. But I think he had something of the Elliot countenance.
Yes.
But then we get Anne being secretly gratified to have met the future owner of Kellynch and to feel that he is truly a gentleman. So yeah, maybe we are starting to think, I wonder if something is going to come of this. But at the same time, Anne is so certain that he's estranged from the family, never going to see him again.
Oh, well, we can see all that, but we could also do a bit of suspecting that she's not appalled that he's going to be taking over Kellynch.
Yeah. But also, after Anne has been basically ignored and sidelined and treated as just someone to play the piano, suddenly in these two chapters we've got not one but two young men admiring her.
Yes.
Then after that, Benwick and Harville join them after breakfast. So we're really getting minute by minute of this day.
Yes.
And they go for their final walk on the Cobb. Once again, Captain Benwick immediately latches onto Anne. And they're again talking about poetry and Lord Byron's Dark Blue Seas. So you're really seeing a connection building up here. You could well at this stage be wondering, maybe the book is going to suddenly surprise you and she's not going to end up with Captain Wentworth. She's going to end up with Captain Benwick.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier. Except, of course, it's not just one possibility. We've got two possibilities. We have to take the fact that he's Mr. Elliot as significant. So we've already got two rivals for Anne.
Yeah. So now we get to the main event in Lyme on the steps on the Cobb. And I think that's probably the main reason Persuasion fans visit Lyme. I know it's why I went to Lyme, and I think it's why you went to Lyme.
Oh, yes, definitely, yes.
And of course, famously, back in 1867, Alfred Lord Tennyson went to Lyme. And when he arrived in Lyme, and he'd walked 9 miles there from Bridgeport, he called on his friend and then, refusing all refreshment, said at once, "Now take me to the Cobb and show me the steps from which Louisa Musgrove fell."
Yes. And that's the thing now, I've been looking at them on the internet, and the ones they show are ones where you've just got a single rock sticking out of the wall and nothing between it and the rock, nothing between it and the ground. Quite dangerous looking steps, whereas my memory is of quite enclosed staircases.
Like I've been saying with the popular culture versions, there are the 3 different sets of steps in Lyme, and the different pop culture versions use different sets. I'll put a photo from each one in the show notes, which will show each of those 3 sets of steps.
Yes.
And also, you may remember I've set up a Google map of all the Persuasion locations. Well, in the bit in Lyme, I've put in the location of each set of steps, and with each one, again, I've put in a little photo. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well.
Yes.
The ones you're talking about, they're called the Granny's Teeth, and they were used in the 1995 film adaptation. And some places say those are the steps, but it seems more likely it's actually the next set of steps along.
Well, I think so, because, I mean, those look very dangerous. You know, it doesn't look as though Mary, say, would even want to go down those steps.
In that adaptation, they do have the women being helped down, and I think you even have Mary saying, I don't like it.
Yes.
I think we might have talked about this in an earlier episode. We suddenly get told, and it's kind of new, we didn't get it in earlier scenes like in the Walk to Winthrop, we suddenly get told this thing about Louisa had to be jumped down the steps by Captain Wentworth. And I guess I'm just thinking, what is meant by being jumped down the steps?
Oh, I'm sure what that means is she stands there, he puts his hands around her waist so he can take a lot of her weight, and she hops down.
Okay.
I mean, that would be sort of very easy on a stile. She'd come down one step, and if she was being daring, she'd stand on the top step of the stile and she'd be hopped down. And so the same thing is happening with these steps. Mm-hmm. Probably at the point where she's standing more or less at eye level with him or a bit higher, and he puts his hand up, grabs her, holds her waist to balance her, and she hops down.
Okay. See, I'd kind of pictured it not around her waist, but holding her hands as she jumps, just so she doesn't overbalance on landing or something. But the description of the fall itself, it's almost banal, because it says she was too precipitate by half a second, she fell on the pavement on the lower Cobb and was taken up lifeless! ! There was no wound, no blood, no visible bruise, but her eyes were closed, she breathed not, her face was like death. But there's no real description of the fall, just she jumped too soon and she was taken up lifeless.
Yes, oh well, perhaps nobody was actually watching.
And I know this is something that rather infuriates Michael. We've got these two competent sailors, and they've been in combat, who are not really knowing what to do and turning to Anne.
Yeah.
My theory is they're used to it with men, but they freak out because it's a woman, a young woman.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right.
Yeah. But, it's left to Anne to keep her head and say, someone should go for a surgeon. No, Benwick should go for a surgeon. He knows where to find one. Anne tells them what to do, and everyone does what Anne says.
Yes.
And then Anne says, I think we should carry her to the inn, which, seriously, they're very lucky she didn't have a spinal injury.
Yes.
Because carrying her to the inn would be the worst thing to do for a spinal injury.
Yes.
So that was, of course, the second Anne showing herself to Wentworth as being a valuable person.
Yes, but in a different way, and also not exactly the kind of firmness he's talking about, but she knows what she's doing.
Yeah. The next stuff that happens in the chapter is Wentworth actually showing he's recognising Anne's value. And we had an email about this from friend of the podcast, Serene, who was particularly struck by this moment where the actual wording is, "Then it is settled, Musgrove," cried Captain Wentworth, "that you stay and that I take care of your sister home. But as to the rest, as to the others, if one stays to assist Mrs. Harville, I think it need be only one. Mrs. Charles Musgrove will, of course, wish to get back to her children, but if Anne will stay, no one so proper, so capable as Anne." And what Serene was particularly struck by is the names in this section. He's on friendly terms with Charles Musgrove, so he just calls him Musgrove, but all the women are given their titles, and yet suddenly Anne is Anne.
Well, even as you read that out, that was striking me, that why isn't he saying Miss Anne?
Yes. Either Miss Anne or Miss Elliot, because Miss Elliot herself isn't there. And it's because, of course, they were engaged 8 years ago. She was
and she's
Anne
still
to him.
Anne. If he dropped Anne, he's now thinking of her as Anne again.
Yes.
He's back to thinking about the person she used to be, yes.
So Serene says Anne probably mourned the fact that she would never hear him call her Anne again. Then suddenly, just like that, twice she hears her name just fall from his lips, and the beauty genuinely is that he doesn't know what he's done, doesn't realise how much he still loves her because he hasn't even admitted it to himself, or catch that he just revealed it to her before he has admitted it to himself. It's just a slip, but it's a slip that says everything. It's in some ways easy to miss because this has been a group of related characters from related families, And lots of them are calling each other by their first names.
Yes.
But in that paragraph, that's where you suddenly see Wentworth's positioning in relation to them. That is such a telling paragraph at the end of the Lyme scene.
Yes.
But then Mary throws a spanner in the works. Because honestly, who could ever think that Mary is going to be any use whatsoever? She's less use than Henrietta.
Yes.
Then there's that last bit that I think you liked when they're in the carriage going back to Uppercross.
Where he makes the assumption that they're partners and he says, I'll do this. Is that going to be all right with you?
Yeah. In fact,
and that's really nice.
Yeah. In fact, he's actually seeking her approval because he says, do you think this is a good plan?
Yes. What he's indicating is that if she has any objection, he'll go along with it.
So, favourite sentence from these chapters? The bit I wanted is in a monstrously long sentence. So I've decided I'll just take the bit I want. So I'll do mine now. It's about when they make the decision to go to Lyme.
Yes.
And it says, Louisa, who was the most eager of the eager, having formed the resolution to go, and besides the pleasure of doing as she liked, being now armed with the idea of merit in maintaining her own way.
Yes.
Which, of course, that comes out of the scene where Captain Wentworth said...
the one behind the hedgerow, yes. Well, the one I did, when they're talking about seeing Mr. Elliot in the inn, and Mary's been saying, isn't it amazing that I didn't know this, and I didn't know that, and I didn't know the other? And putting all these very extraordinary circumstances together, said Captain Wentworth, we must consider it to be the arrangement of Providence that you should not be introduced to your cousin. I think that's the funniest, the wittiest thing anyone has said so far in this book.
So the characters we're talking about in this episode are Captains Harville and Benwick.
The very first point I wanted to make was that when we first see Captain Wentworth, we get this picture that naval officers are very prepared to talk about their adventures.
But Harville and Benwick aren't like that in the same way.
They aren't. That this is something that naval officers tend to accept, and up to a point they are too, because, you know, everyone hears all about Captain Benwick and his fiancée who died, and they're telling a lot to one another about their situations and how they're handling them.
The three of them, Wentworth, Harville and Benwick, they're quite different from each other.
Yes.
I wonder, is Harville being presented as just slightly lower down the social ladder
I think
than the
so.
others?
And Mrs. Harville, she says at one point, and for goodness knows why, that Mrs. Harville was even lower.
Well, it says Mrs. Harville was an experienced nurse. I wondered, did that mean she'd been used to nursing her own children when they got sick, or did it mean she had actually been a nurse before she married Captain Harville?
Well, I took it to mean that having been married to a naval officer, she'd had a lot of occasions when she was either having to help or having to take on various sick or injured naval people.
Because unlike Mrs. Croft, she didn't sail with him.
Well, we don't know she didn't.
Well, she didn't always sail with him, because we know earlier Wentworth brought them to him, but also he talks about returning and wanting to see them again.
It may have been partly, of course, that they had children and the Crofts didn't.
Yeah. Captain Benwick is younger than the other two. I mean, it says he's younger, and also it says he was First Lieutenant of the Laconia, so that's presumably when Captain Wentworth was Captain of the Laconia. Yes. So he's only just got his own ship.
Or has he got a ship?
Yes.
I don't think he's got his own ship.
He has. It's the Gripper. No,
I mean, Grappler. I think he might have been promoted to captain.
He's been promoted to commander, which is why he's called captain, because he has his own ship now. His rank is commander, but he has the courtesy title of captain.
Yes.
It's like Captain Cook was a commander, but was referred to as captain because he was in charge of the Endeavour.
Yeah.
I mean, it says that he got money by his first lieutenant's share of the prize money the Laconia took. And then it also says that promotion had come at last. And it talks about the ship he's on that Captain Wentworth went to tell him about Fanny Harville dying.
At some point, yes.
Yeah.
But at the moment, neither of them is on board a ship.
Well, because as it said at the start of the book, with the peace being declared, all the naval officers are back on land looking for something to do. Because of all his reading and poetry and giving way to sensibility like Marianne Dashwood, he's not quite what you picture as a sort of out there courageous naval officer. And yet to have got promotion...
Yes, well, at 12, 13, he's shoved on board a ship. He's got to look after himself. But he's obviously been the kind of young man who can more or less stop people laughing at him for doing the sort of things he wants to do.
Yeah.
Because if he'd been wanting to do a lot of reading and talking about books on board a ship, unless he had very, very polite fellow midshipmen, unless he could stick up for himself, he would have sort of got pretty ashamed.
Yeah, he was probably doing reading but just not talking about it.
But if people wanted to have a go at him, they could have a go at him for reading, they could tear up his books, they could do all sorts of things. So he was obviously perfectly capable as a 13, 14, 15-year-old of sticking up for himself among the other midshipmen and also perfectly prepared not to sort of give in about doing the things he liked to do. So that's one side of him. But on the other side, he's got this intellectual side. No, it's more than intellectual. This sentimental side, sensibilities side.
Yeah.
And no doubt people like Captain Wentworth read books themselves.
But Captain Harville didn't. I guess the other thing with Benwick is he does seem to move on quite quickly. Anne is right. If Louisa hadn't had her fall and they'd all gone back to Uppercross, Benwick would have found his way to Uppercross. He would have visited them. He probably would have basically fallen in love with Anne.
Yes.
Because that didn't happen, but there was the circumstances with Louisa. He fell in love with Louisa. It didn't take him really all that long to move on from Fanny Harville.
No, when she thought she was suffering from a broken heart more than he was, she was dead right.
Yeah. Well, as she says later, he had an affectionate heart. He must love someone. Benwick seems to have not gone for a duplicate of Fanny Harville.
No, he didn't care. He just wanted somebody who would sympathise with him,
Which actually goes back to what Wentworth said at the start. I mean, he's planning to marry, but he says a few looks, a few smiles, a few compliments to the Navy and I'm a lost man. That's almost what happens with Benwick, except he wants someone to let me read poetry to them.
Yes.
You can also understand why Harville is so upset that Benwick seems to have moved on so quickly.
Yes. And Wentworth seems to have taken his feelings very seriously. You know, the fact that he turned up to break the news to him as soon as his ship came in and then stayed, I think it's a week with him, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that.
Just sort of helping him get over it.
Yeah. So it's like both Harville and Wentworth have possibly overestimated the depth of Benwick's feeling, because Wentworth also says to Anne, Fanny Harville was a very superior woman and Anne doesn't get over it so quickly. But Benwick does.
Yes. But I think that more significant in Jane Austen's portrait of naval officers is the fact that Captain Wentworth spent all that time with him, that he had that level of empathy, probably an exaggerated level of empathy.
Yeah.
But, I mean, after all, this whole book, she's really in love with the Navy, isn't she?
Yeah.
And she obviously saw quite a bit of her brothers at different times when they came back, particularly when they came back with their families.
Yeah.
And she must have seen a lot that she admired in what she was seeing, their relationship with one another, their relationship with their families. That somehow being sailors hasn't meant, you know, they don't care about their families, they care more.
And you get this picture in these chapters of the friendship between them, and you have Louisa saying how wonderful the Navy is, but you also have Anne thinking these people would have been my friends. She's seeing this kind of camaraderie and friendship that's probably going deeper than anything she's experienced in her current circle.
And how domestic they are prepared to be. They want to come back and be with their families.
And you know, in that scene at the end where Harville is talking to Anne, that picture he gives of wanting to see your wife and family and telling yourself they can't be here until such a time, but all the while hoping for them 12 hours sooner. Yeah. It's absolutely beautiful.
Yes, yes. In my talk for this episode, I want to look at what was happening in English poetry between the time in the early 1800s when Jane Austen showed it as inspiring Marianne's sensibility, and in 1815 when she was writing Persuasion and commenting on the richness of the present age. In preparing this talk, I've been surprised to discover how much more familiar I am with the poetry of the Romantics than I am with the poetry that influenced Jane Austen with her earlier novels. I can think of almost no lines by Cooper and Crabbe, except actually some from John Gilpin, but my memory is cluttered with all sorts of tags from the Romantic poems that I've picked up from what, to use the word you use so often, popular culture. Not, that is, from university courses that I've done in literature, but from school readers and anthologies, and from quotations and references in the 20th century novels that I've always been reading. And I'm afraid those memories have come to dominate this talk. When we were discussing Sense and Sensibility, I think I suggested that Marianne's sensibility was shown as teetering on the verge between what was then known as sentimentalism and indulgence of the feelings when considering the sufferings of others, and romanticism, which was the celebration of the emotions roused by nature and the grandeur of nature. Romanticism in histories of English literature is generally seen as having made its first appearance with the publication of lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798. In lyrical ballads, though, most of Wordsworth's poems were still in the Cooper-Crabbe style, poems about the virtues and sufferings of the poor, poems with titles like The Foster Mother's Tale, Goody Blake and Harry Gill, Simon Lee the Old Huntsman, and We Are Seven. This last one is this poem where the little girl insists that there are 7 children in her family, even though 2 are dead, and that was still around in popular culture. That is, people would know what you were talking about if you mentioned it when I was growing up. Have you ever heard of We Are Seven?
Only at university. No, I think it might have cropped up occasionally in passing in books written in the mid-20th century. I'm not sure I've come across it in more recent books.
I think mid-20th century is about what I'm regarding that as popular culture, in that they were still being read by people like you and me. Nevertheless, during this period when Jane Austen was tinkering with Sense and Sensibility, Wordsworth's emphasis changed and he began to stress the importance of nature. In March 1802, for example, he wrote, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die." I mean, that does sound the sort of thing that the Dashwood girls would have been reading. Wordsworth wrote My Heart Leaps Up on the night of March the 28th, 1802. And he then began a very long poem on the same theme called Intimations of Immortality from Recollection of Early Childhood, first published in 1807. So all this was happening when Jane Austen was writing Sense and Sensibility. It started happening while she was living in Steventon, and she revised the text of Sense and Sensibility in Chawton in 1809-10. So at much the time when the Wordsworth view of nature was taking hold, Wordsworth's most famous poem, Daffodils, was published. And I bet you've heard of that.
I don't. Yeah. Again, though, mostly from university, but I'm sure I've come across it.
Oh, no, you would have come across it in books. But between the time when Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion were published, the fashion in poetry had changed again. It was still romantic in that it focused on being moved by the grand, the noble, and approving of those emotions. But the major poets, the leading practitioners, were now what she calls somewhere Mr. Scott and Lord Byron, which I think is lovely because you realise Scott is still at the beginning of his career when she was getting so enthusiastic about him. Romanticism had changed in that these poets were now asking their audiences to identify with the tenderest songs and the impassioned descriptions of hopeless agony, and the various lines which imaged a broken heart or a mind destroyed by wretchedness of people from very different places and cultures from their own. Scott wrote long narrative poems set in distant times, like the border conflicts in Scotland and the English civil wars. The Lady of the Lake has three main plots: the contest among three men to win the love of Ellen Douglas; secondly, the feud and reconciliation of King James V of Scotland and James Douglas; and a war between the Lowland Scots, led by James V, and the Highland clans, led by Roderick Dhu. Jane Austen must have been reading these all the time she was writing Mansfield Park and Emma.
Mm-hmm. I've been reading Susan Allen Ford's book, What Jane Austen's Characters Read and Why. And in the chapter on Persuasion, she says that with Robert Southey, Walter Scott was the principal promulgator of the metrical romance in the first decade of the century. He dominated the poetic scene with The Lay of the Last Minstrel, which was in 1805, Marmion in 1808, and The Lady of the Lake in 1810. She says that sales of these works were excellent. Marmion was priced 1 guinea and a half. The 2,000 copies of this edition were all disposed of in less than a month. And then later editions sold many, many thousands more copies, over 23,000 copies sold by the time of the 9th edition.
And then, in 1812, the much younger Byron woke to find himself famous, which is what he said, with the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which I've certainly never read, and I didn't even copy the plot of. Byron had just come back from a trip to Turkey, and he now began to write heroic poems of love and strife, set in the unfamiliar but romantic setting of the Ottoman Empire. So what I'm trying to say is they wrote about totally different places. Yeah. I mean, there were two romantic places, but they were very, very different from one another. But they were both foreign places to their readers.
Mm. What Susan Allen Ford writes is that Lord Byron published the first 12 cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage to such overwhelming critical and commercial acclaim that Scott turned to another genre, beginning work on Waverley. So Byron was so successful that Scott basically said, I'm out of here.
Well, he more or less said, I'm out of poetry, I'll have a go at prose, which Byron never bothered to do.
What she writes is the first edition of the Giaour was published in 1813. By 1815, there had been 14 editions of the poem. The Bride of Abydos, which was published in December 1813, ran through 5 editions that month. That's how popular that one was. I don't know, maybe people bought it for Christmas. Then The Corsair was published on the 1st of February 1814, and while I don't think Anne and Benwick explicitly discussed that one, it would have been very current because they were having their conversation in about November 1814.
Yes.
And on its day of publication, 10,000 copies were sold.
Scott was still part of popular culture when I was growing up, and I could probably recite most of the poem about how young Lochinvar snatches his love from the wedding feast after she'd been forced to marry a laggard in love and a dastard in war. I thought, however, that Byron was different, that the only poem that we were likely to recognise now was the one on the eve of Waterloo about the Duchess of Richmond's ball.
So basically both of them were writing sort of long epic story poems.
Yes,
So the kinds of stuff Marianne and Eleanor were reading was all about nature.
Yes.
And the beauties of nature and how wonderful nature is.
And how it lifted your heart and it made you a better person.
Whereas Byron and Scott were stories about people and people's emotions.
Yes. Well, that's the picture I've got.
In the book it says that Benwick showed himself so intimately acquainted with all the tenderest songs of the one poet and all the impassioned descriptions of hopeless agony of the other. What Susan Allen Ford writes is that both Byron's and Scott's heroes are characterised by bravery, pride and the capacity for violence. And we shouldn't forget that Benwick and Wentworth have been engaged in a violent occupation.
Yes, unlike Anne and all the gentry around the place.
Yes, but she points out that Byron also has an emphasis on the interior spaces of the psyche, and so his heroes are more solitary, more turned upon themselves, and opposed to social structures than Scott's are.
That's the picture that Anne's got, is that Benwick is being encouraged to be introspective, is encouraging himself to brood on the death of his fiancée.
But it's Byron much more than Scott that's encouraging that. Scott is all about the heroics.
Yes.
Byron is about the interior.
The introspection, yes.
Yeah. The pop culture version I'm talking about today is the 2022 adaptation of Persuasion, made by Netflix and starring Dakota Johnson and Cosmo Jarvis. This runs for 1 hour and 48 minutes, so it's about the same length as the 1995 BBC one, slightly longer than the 2007 and much shorter than the 1970s BBC series. There are a lot of things people in the Jane Austen fan community feel passionately about and have big arguments about. Of course, the big one is Fanny Price, those who love her and those who hate her. Also, arguments between whether Colin Firth or Matthew McFadyen was the better Darcy. But since 2022, I think this adaptation has probably roused more passionate discussions than anything else.
Pro and against, yes.
So some people like it because they feel that it's smart and it's irreverent and it talks to a modern viewership. Other people hate it with the fire of 1,000 suns.
Yes.
When this first came out, I actually wrote up my thoughts. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode because I had so many thoughts that I know I'm not going to be able to cover all of them here.
Yes.
So let me start by saying that, in my opinion, as an adaptation of the book, it is just an epic fail because it completely changed everything that makes Persuasion my favourite novel. Characters and plot, you kind of know that changes are going to happen, but this one, the character of Anne was changed fundamentally, and tonally the whole thing was different to the point which at times it felt like it was telling a different story. If you look at it as a film in its own right, independent of the source text, then there were some aspects of it I enjoyed, but taken overall, and for some things in particular, I'm a lot closer to the Fire of 1,000 Suns camp.
Yes.
There were actually 2 versions of Persuasion planned for 2022. The other one was going to star Sarah Snook and Joel Fry, but when the Netflix one was announced, this one just got cancelled, which is a shame because a lot of people feel...
It sounds as though it would have been a lot nicer.
Well, it could well have been. It wasn't trying to be a smart modern take. So 3 particular things that came out sort of quite early you got from trailers, etc. The first is consciously diverse casting. So most members of the Musgrove family and Lady Russell and Benwick are all played by black actors, and Mr. Elliot is played by an Asian actor. Then there are conscious anachronisms in the dialogue. For example, Anne looks at some sheet music that Wentworth wrote for her and said, "I still have the playlist he made." It also has fourth wall breaking where Anne just turns her head and talks directly to the audience.
Yes.
And in and of themselves, I think this can all be fine if it's done well. Not long before this film came out, I saw a stage production of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, and it had all of these elements and I loved it. And actually, diverse casting, I think it's fine regardless. I have heard people argue that having that many people of colour in the gentry gives a false impression of history. But this isn't history, it's fiction, And really, it's not that much different, I think, from having people with perfect teeth or cosmetically enhanced lips and cheekbones.
Yes.
And in any case, if you look at Dakota Johnson's hair in this production, then you have to say skin colour is the least of this film's issues in terms of historical accuracy. And I also don't have a problem, in principle, with consciously anachronistic dialogue or fourth wall breaking. And it did make me laugh on occasion in this production. Although I didn't think it was as well done as it was in the stage version of Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And having said that, if you're going to do it with an Austen book, I'm not sure Persuasion is the one that I personally would do it with. I kind of see why they did it, because Anne is so interior that this gives you an insight into what she's feeling, but when so much of it was just snarky criticisms, I'm going to talk a bit later about how I felt they just totally changed the character of Anne, and I didn't like it. Because I think the fourth wall breaking and the anachronistic dialogue, this was part of what I think is a significant tonal shift from the novel to the film. And other aspects of that are what lead me to calling it an epic fail as an adaptation. But another part of the tonal shift that I'm going to get over really briefly, because I really don't want to go into it, was the use of what I call embarrassment comedy. Having characters caught in awkward situations so that the audience can laugh at them. And I just hate that sort of comedy. So I'm not actually going to mention really any of those scenes because I don't want to think about them. And in a related aspect, I'd also like to quote from YouTuber Carolina Zabrowska's review when she said, "By the way, can we stop pretending like overconsumption of alcohol is funny?" And actually, I'm going to put a link to her review in the show notes because I agreed with pretty much everything she said. Before I talk about other aspects of the tonal shift, maybe I'll just run through some plot differences. Because most of them are the kinds of cuts and changes you expect given the running time, given the different medium, not too much different from what some of the others have done. This one starts with a flashback with some voiceover by Anne.
Did any of the others have a flashback?
The Spanish one had 2 flashback scenes, but they didn't start with a flashback.
Yes.
There was no Anne listening to everyone at Uppercross complaining. They'd cut poor Richard completely. Disappointingly, nothing about Anne taking charge when little Charles has his fall, which again I felt affects the story they're telling. There's no Mrs. Smith, so you don't get that part of Mr. Elliot's backstory, which feeds into Mr. Elliot's characterisation. I'm also going to just run through some things about the supporting characters, because most of them I really liked. But then I'm going to talk in more detail about the tonal shifts and the characters of Anne and Wentworth. This film follows the tradition of having Sir Walter Elliot played not by an older, very handsome actor, but by a really good character actor or comic actor. So in this case, Sir Walter Elliot is played by Richard E. Grant. He was really funny as Sir Walter Elliot. I really enjoyed it. And there were lots of scenes of portraits of Sir Walter Elliot being put on walls and carried around. It was over the top, but it was funny.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Elliot was also funny, but she was almost entirely just outright rude to Anne. It did make me laugh, but it was not really the Elizabeth of the book who wouldn't have been rude in that same sort of way. Similarly, Mary was the complete hypochondriac, complete self-centered, really made me laugh, but so much more over the top. The Mary of the book is funny and over the top, but you can kind of find a believable character in there. This one was just a caricature, but really funny. Charles Musgrove, nice solid presence. A bit over the top in that on the return from Winthrop, you see him literally carrying Mary in over his shoulder. Presumably she refused to walk any further.
Yes.
So not played for seriousness, played for comedy, but I liked him. I liked them all. And the last one I want to talk about is Mr. Elliot, who was played by Henry Golding. He was fantastic. He absolutely stole the scenes he was in because bags of charisma. And you remember I said that there's no Mrs. Smith. So you don't get that side of Mr. Elliot's backstory.
So what, you don't basically get the real villain?
You don't get the real villain. What you get is someone who is, to Anne, completely and utterly upfront about the kind of person he is, which is he wants money. He doesn't want Mrs. Clay to marry Sir Walter because
she might have a baby.
Because she might have a baby and he won't get the money, and he will do what he has to do to stop it. And he is so upfront about it. He is charming with it. He is really funny, and The chemistry between him and Anne was great. I really wish he'd been playing Wentworth, but I did read somewhere that he was actually offered the part of Wentworth and he turned it down. So that brings me to what I hated tonally about the film. The biggest thing was Anne Elliot. Instead of an Anne Elliot who has come to terms with what she did in the past and she regrets it and she's suffered, but she's getting on with her life, this is an Anne Elliot who has spent the past 8 years wallowing in grief and is upfront to other people. She was completely and utterly different from the book. And I just feel they've taken Anne Elliot and they've turned her into Elizabeth Bennet with a drinking problem.
Yes.
And that changes everything about the story. Another change they made to the story is that Anne and Wentworth almost never talk to each other in the first half of the book. In this, they have 3 proper conversations of increasing seriousness before the bath scenes. And what didn't come through in these conversations, and I don't know whether this was the actors or whether it was the director, but I got no sense of turbulent emotion between surface pleasantries. I did feel that Cosmo Jarvis, as Wentworth, there was no chemistry between him and Anne. Aside from those 3 conversations between Anne and Wentworth, there was also a conversation between Anne and Louisa. On the walk to Winthrop, she says, "I think I'm falling in love with him." All these scenes of characters talking to other characters about their emotions felt really wrong, felt like they felt we can't do this with acting, we need to explain what characters are feeling. But some of the earlier Persuasion adaptations proved that you can do it with character acting. So anything you got told about Anne's emotions was in scenes of Anne on her own, telling you direct to camera, sometimes drinking, sometimes sinking in a bath, all these cliches of modern rom-coms that just don't fit with Anne Elliot. The other thing with Anne that I forgot to mention is there's nothing about her having lost her bloom and getting it back. And the last thing that I haven't mentioned all along, because it is the most completely out of left field thing, Anne has a pet rabbit. For much of the time, she is carrying the rabbit around with her. Sometimes she even talks to the rabbit. For some reason, the rabbit didn't get to go to Lyme, but it did come to Bath with her. I kind of, not for Persuasion really, but I kind of liked the unexpected randomness of this rabbit and the fact that it was never explained why she has a pet rabbit.
And it didn't have a name?
No, it didn't have a name. I subsequently discovered it's probably a reference to a TV series called Fleabag, where she has a pet something, I forget what. So after saying all that, I just thought I might give a recap of the final scenes of the film, because they were kind of interesting. I will give this film credit. Unlike 2007, unlike 1995, it didn't try to bring in the cancelled chapter. So for my money, it gets a tick for that. How Wentworth had time to write his letter in between the end of the conversation with Anne and Captain Harville and the moment he hands it over is just left as an exercise for the viewer. As Anne is running after him, she does run after him, but not as extremely as happened in the 2007 version, which was just silly. Where she catches up, it is the gravel walk in Bath. Oh. So, obviously in the book, they meet in the street and then they go to the gravel walk. This, they just cut straight to the gravel walk, but I did like the fact that they used the actual gravel walk. I thought that was nice. It finishes outside a church. It's obviously a wedding happening. And you think, oh, this must be Anne and Wentworth's wedding. It's actually Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay's wedding. Oh. But then the final scene is Anne and Wentworth up on a hill overlooking the sea, Wentworth teaching Anne to use a sextant. If you hadn't read the book and you were just looking at this as a rom-com, it's okay. A lot of it was very much not to my personal taste because of the embarrassment comedy and the alcohol comedy. But I will be honest and say there were some aspects I did enjoy. It made me laugh at times. I did like almost all of the casting of the minor characters. I was completely happy and positive about the consciously diverse casting, but I really, really hated the fundamental changing of Anne's character, and I hated the way people talked to each other about their feelings. So that's why I say that as an adaptation of the book, it was just an epic fail. It just missed everything that I thought the book was trying to do. And it was telling a story that while it touched on many of the same plot points, the emotional story was completely and utterly different. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. Next time we're going to be reading chapters 13 to 15 of Persuasion.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the sacred text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com. We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.